Excuse me. Good morning, everybody. My name is Emily, and I'm going to be a session staff member here. And I would like to present the remote speakers for this session. First up, we have Flurina Dobler, who is going to present Managed Retreat Due to Natural Hazard Decision Support Framework based on Case History Analysis. So, Flurina, you may begin and share your screen.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
I'm talking about managed retreat due to natural hazards with a focus on Switzerland. This is my master's thesis at the University of Zurich, and my supervisors are Christian Huggel and Samuel Weber. In Switzerland, areas with known current and past active mass movements cover an area of 6 to 8%, but only very few times was managed retreat due to natural hazards implemented. At the same time, we know that climate change is leading to an increase in natural disasters globally and also in Switzerland. This and infrastructure that was built into areas prone to natural hazards together lead to a growing risk, which then people are exposed to. Researchers have found that values that are difficult or impossible to monetize are often disregarded when making decisions about retreat. Such are, for example, most social or environmental factors, as well as the needs of the relocated persons. There is also a deficiency in a locally adaptable guideline to managed retreat. For Switzerland, it was found that the affected persons are often insufficiently informed about the hazard, risks, and protective measures. The cooperation of the different stakeholders and organizational units can be improved. As is the case internationally, each situation of possible relocation is assessed individually, so those responsible are not able to rely on any set procedure. To address some of these missing aspects, I developed an evaluation and decision framework. It should serve as a guideline for stakeholders to consider retreat as equivalent to other measure types, to adapt the decisions made to the local situation, and to involve the affected community. To reach this, a case study of affected locations in Switzerland, together with interviews, led to factors that influence people's attitude and decisions, which were then analyzed and integrated into the framework. The sites selected for the case study are or have all been affected by natural hazards, and relocation has occurred or might be occurring in the future. By analyzing these events and reports of these places, knowledge can be gained for the future. And this then served as a basis for the search of factors that are influencing the stakeholders' attitude towards natural hazards and retreat, and show their concerns and needs. These can then be integrated into the decision-making process of relocation. One such place is the village of Brienz in the Swiss Alps, which is pictured on the right side. The village is home to about 100 people and 200 vacation guests, and the entire southern flank of the mountain above down to the valley bottom is characterized by a large slope movement, which has been active since the last ice age. On the one hand, the movement of the area around the village accelerated over the last 20 years, and the velocity is up to 1.5 meters per year and causes severe damage to the houses and infrastructure. This movement can probably be slowed down by a drainage tunnel, which drains the water from the slide and is under construction now. On the other hand, the hazard from rockfall and landslides from the slope above the village increased with the acceleration of the movement, and this is at the moment very present as the velocity of one part accelerated very strongly this spring, which is why the residents of Brienz have been evacuated for more than a month now. And last week, on the 16th of June, 1.2 million cubic meters of rock loosened and halted only very shortly before the village. This can be seen in these before and after pictures of the 15th and 16th of June. At the moment, it is uncertain when the residents can return, and the scenario of relocation has been in planning for 4 years in parallel with the other measures for the case that at some point in the future there will be no other way. The factors represent the people's needs and concerns and influence the stakeholders' attitude towards natural hazard and relocation. It is therefore helpful and important to include them in a relocation process. These factors were found out within general research, the case study, and interviews. They were then grouped into the aspects of hazard or risk, financial and legal, and social aspects, and formed the basis for the then developed framework. And sustainable measures are located at the very center, in the intersection of all main aspects, which is colored orange in this figure. The so-created evaluation and decision framework aims to contribute to the standardization of the decision-making process, but this without disregarding the individual level, which varies from case to case. The framework presents the complete process from the discovery of a hazard, the situation analysis, the option analysis and measure decision to the final implementation of the risk reduction measures, and it provides suggestions for subsequent development. This simplified illustration is intended to provide an overview of the processes in the framework. The evaluation framework with the sections communication and knowledge forms the frame, and the experience from past relocations have shown that a mutual exchange of information should be regularly organized during the whole process, and that newly gained knowledge should lead to an adjustment of the temporary measures and to further communication. One example relates to the communication between the different stakeholders. A person affected by retreat stated that she always has to read the information from the expert several times to understand it. It is therefore central during the process that the technical information is communicated in the way that everyone can understand it. The decision framework with the decision and measure sections provide guidance in deciding which measures to implement. In order to reach a decision regarding the measure, the criteria resulting from the factors are evaluated and weighted for each measure using the method of the utility analysis. The measure evaluation is carried out by different stakeholders and experts independently of each other. And the criteria shown here are based on the factor analysis from the cases in Switzerland, but they should be locally adapted to each case. The scoring of the measures resulting from the analysis should then serve as a guideline for the decision makers to support them. So, for example, if the decision framework is applied to find a temporary measure, it could lead the decision makers to implement a road closure with traffic light system together with evacuations. And while these temporary measures provide transitional risk reduction, longer-term measures, including managed relocation, can be decided, planned, and implemented. And lastly, a directive is given for the implementation of a relocation and the subsequent event analysis. This framework is designed to serve as a guideline during the decision-making process and is intended to lead to a sustainable decision on a risk reduction measure. It can be used to also assess non-measurable criteria, such as social aspects, to address the needs of local communities during relocation. However, this always involves a certain degree of subjectivity. As the framework is adaptable to the local context, it can be applied to different natural hazards and in different countries. These are my references. And now I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Flurina. And now I'd like to present the next remote speaker, who is Kensuke Otsuyama. How does housing recovery and relocation process disconnect or reconnect in neighborhoods? Thank you. You may begin.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so my name is Kensuke. I'm from Tokyo. And my title is How does housing recovery and relocation process disconnect or reconnect in the neighborhood? So I'm paying special attention on disaster public housing. So I'm mainly focusing on relocation after tsunami. And this is totally different from buyout because, for example, this is the impacted area by tsunami, and the people need to relocate because of zoning regulation. So they need to relocate here or there. And usually buyout in the United States is mainly for homeowners, but in here, the disaster public housing were built after the disaster. So renters also enjoy this program. So past research pointed out public housing in the United States mostly demolished or limited participation for recovery process. But as I told you, more disaster public housing were built. For instance, 525 units increased 2,600 units. And other literature in Japan pointed out the disconnecting with previous community due to the relocation. So because of moving into the new environment caused mental stress, or someone committing suicide due to the loneliness. So very simple, my research question is, does disaster public housing makes disaster survivor face other risks? So to answer these questions, I did a questionnaire survey to one city, which is Kesenuma. The city was severely impacted. The tsunami killed more than 1,400 people. 15,000 buildings were damaged. So collaborating with local government, I distributed the questionnaire survey, 23,000 households, and I collected 4,000 or 18.5%. And I also used a semi-structured interview for the disaster public housing residents. And one of the key variables is the distance of relocation. For example, this red shows the disaster public housing. So how many meters they need to relocate? And also one of the key variable is the neighborhood voluntary civic association. This is the boundary of smallest unit in Japan. So we are calling this a neighborhood. So I used QGIS to check or measure the distance of relocation. So for your information, I'd like to introduce 6 major spatial transformation recovery project in Japan. But due to the time limitation, I will explain the detail of group relocation and disaster public housing. So first, group relocation. So the local government purchased not only tsunami impacted area, but also new site for the relocation. So it at least 4 or 5 years for the implementation. It takes a long time. And disaster public housing, of course, it's for the, it's really affordable housing, very cheap monthly payment. The project mainly for the those who lost their homes. And there are two types, condominium type of disaster public house or a detached house. So I'd like to tell you about the findings. The first finding is maladaptation due to the relocation. So as you can see, this blue shows the tsunami inundation area, and this black lattice shows the hazardous zone. It means prohibition, you cannot build houses. So those who lived here need to relocate. And this orange triangle shows the relocation place. And this red square shows disaster public housing. So most of the people, if they have enough money, they can rebuild by themselves, by their own funding. Those who cannot afford housing, they moved to disaster public housing. But unfortunately, due to the flood risk maps update 2020, some of the neighborhood are under risk of flooding. So for example, this disaster public housing, unfortunately, they relocate from coastal area, but unfortunately they live in a high flood risk area. For example, this purple shows 5 to 10 meter. So they suppose relocation makes them safe, but in terms of flooding, they faced another disaster risk. And the second finding is the distance. So based on the past literature, I measure the distance. For example, I collect the pre-disaster address and the post-disaster address, and I identify the better centers of this neighborhood, and I measure the distance one by one. Based on the questionnaire survey, 111 residents lived in disaster public housing, and 1/4, 29 of respondents answered moved within the same neighborhood. But some of them relocate more than 2 kilometers or 4 kilometers or 6 kilometers. And overall average of relocation distance was 1,909 meters. And average distance is very diverse per disaster public housing. For example, this disaster public housing, the average was only 764 meters. It means many people relocate very close. But this neighborhood, disaster public housing, 2.4 meters. But this is the longest one, 4.2 kilometers. So this disaster public housing has different characteristic of the neighborhood. And again, due to the time limitation, I will explain the detail about these two cases. The first one, this is kind of the mixed neighborhood. As you can see, the orange roofs, these houses were disaster public housing, but these houses were self-built relocation. So it means this neighborhood has mixed disaster public housing and self-built. And most of the neighborhood, most of the residents relocate mainly from this neighborhood. So it means the characteristic of the neighborhood were quite similar between pre-disaster and post-disaster. So in this neighborhood, there was a voluntary civic association, which means neighborhood association. Successfully, they could organize because of the experienced leader in this neighborhood. But on the other hand, this disaster public housing, this neighborhood consists with only disaster public housing. And as I mentioned that there are different background of neighborhood. And some of them try to organize new neighborhood voluntary civic association, but it didn't function. It didn't work well. So even different distance, these two neighborhood has a totally different situation in post-disaster recovery phase. So one of the discussion is the root cause of bifurcation point is lottery. The past literature pointed out they used lottery to select neighborhood because if the person wants to relocate this disaster public housing, they cannot select by themselves because of the lottery, because the national government try to use the equality of opportunity. So there is a trade-off between house type and the distance. So one of the conclusion is the difficulty of organizing nature-based neighborhood voluntary association is embedded in social structure. So key takeaway, I'm showing two key takeaways. The first, maladaptation. So they're supposed to relocate far from the tsunami, but there is another risk of flooding. And the second key takeaway is the close relocation for disaster public housing. So distance is very important. Should not far from the pre-disaster address to post-disaster address. So that's all. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you, Kensuke, and I would like to introduce our next speaker, Elizabeth Fussell.
While they're getting things started, I just want to say thank you, everyone, for making it to the Friday morning 8:30 session. You all deserve an award. Great, thank you. All right, so at this conference on managed retreat, it's worthwhile to step back a little bit and think about how we're interpreting our empirical results and whether the idea of managed retreat actually maps onto what we're seeing in the data. So we titled our paper Stability and Change in US Migration Systems After Disasters, because we're doing right now a more descriptive exercise and looking at what we're seeing in the empirical record, and then trying to think through some of the hypotheses and interpretive frameworks that we might use. Considering migration, and we do consider managed retreat as one of those frameworks, but of course there would be other possible interpretations. So one of the things that is really motivating to me about our research on observed past data is we can look at whether individuals or migration system, people living in migration systems are actually retreating from hazards on their own, independently of government programs. And so that's one of the motivations for looking into this topic. I want to just introduce my colleague, Katie McConnell, who's the co-author on this paper, and Jack DeWard and Catherine Curtis, who aren't here, are longtime collaborators in our research on migration systems and disasters. So let me introduce you to a migration system. A migration system is the system of all counties that are tied together through an in or out migration flow. And so in this approach, we focus on the focal county or counties that are affected by a disaster, and then consider all of those counties that are connected to it as the receiving counties for migrants after a disaster, and potentially the sending counties for the people who might migrate to the disaster affected county in the post-disaster period. So there are two elements of a migration system: the ties, which is any linkage between two counties, and then the size of that tie, which is the number of migrants that flow along that tie. And then each of these, a system has two dimensions, which is the in-migration system and the out-migration system. The map you see there is a map of the in-migration system for Orleans Parish in Louisiana in the year after Hurricane Katrina. So all of the counties that you see are counties that were sending migrants to Orleans Parish, and the color of the county reflects the size of that flow. So we have two hypotheses in this research project that I'm presenting today. And the first would be the mobility hypothesis, which in a managed retreat framework, we might interpret as risk aversion. And what we would see in the model, and we're estimating quantitative models, which I'll describe in a minute, is that relative to the baseline pre-disaster period, we would expect to see increases in the number of ties to other counties relative to the focal count, to the disaster affected counties in the disaster year, and then also elevated ties and flows in the post-disaster year. So in other words, there would be, those hypotheses are represented by plus marks in the out-migration dimension. And in the in-migration dimension, we might see a contraction of the migration system as fewer counties are sending migrants to the disaster affected counties, and the size of the flows that are going would be smaller in both the disaster period and the post-disaster period. So that's what we would expect to see if there were sort of voluntary managed retreat. The competing hypothesis would be immobility, and we might interpret that as place attachment. These are hypotheses and frameworks for interpretive frameworks that we've seen a lot during the conference this year. And in this framework, you would expect to see either no change in the disaster year and the post-disaster period relative to the baseline, or you might see an elevated out-migration flow and elevation in the number of tied places in the disaster year, which would be indicative of rather long-term evacuation because it would last more than a year. And then that would be complemented by a possibility of return migration or in-migration in the post-disaster period. So in other words, we're either going to see stability in the system, or we might see a little bit of sort of expansion and contraction, or out migration and return if there's some level of evacuation. So the data we use to test these hypotheses come from the Internal Revenue Service IRS migration flows data set, which is a public use data set that we use from 1990 to 2012. What I'll show you a little bit more how this data set looks. But what it does conceptually is it looks at tax returns for 2 consecutive years, and it compares the address of the tax filer in year 1 and year 2. If there's no change in the address on the tax return, and really what we're looking at is a county level change. If the tax return is filed from the same county in both years, that person is a stayer or a non-migrant. If there's a change in which there's a different county in the 2 years, then that person would be classified as a mover between those 2 counties, which is how we would get the measure of both ties and flow sizes. So we're measuring the number of out or in ties between counties and the average size of those out or in flows. So one of the limitations of this data is that it only counts tax filers, which is about 86% of all households in the United States. and it's not a random sample, it would exclude any household that does not have earned income. And that would mainly be retirees and people whose income is just benefits, obtained from benefits. So mainly those would be older folks and very low income people. So there's that bias in this data set. We also do not use the data from 2012 onward, because when the IRS took over processing of this data, they changed the algorithm in a way which we don't have confidence in the actual numbers. We're exploring the reasons for that. We did write an exploratory paper, which is referenced here, which explains our concerns. And we're actually discussing these concerns with the IRS right now to see if we can do something different. So here's the matrix of data that I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I just want to point out that what you can see in that toy example is that on the diagonal, you measure all of the stayers between two counties. And then on the off diagonal cells, that's where you observe a county to county migration flow. You count up the number of movers and you get this very nice system level data. So what we're doing in this method, in our study today, is we're estimating a difference in difference model with county level fixed effects. And so basically what that will do is show us the within county change in the count of ties and in the average flow of ties between the treated counties, which are the disaster affected counties, and the nearby unexposed counties. We define a disaster exposed or treated county as a county that received a FEMA individual assistance designation that would indicate that households were eligible to receive individual level assistance. And then the untreated counties would be those counties that are proximate, but didn't have the IA designation. So the event year is the year of the disaster, which would in the county flow data be the pair of years between that starts with the disaster year and then the subsequent year to capture anybody who moved as a result of the disaster. And then the post-event years would be on average a 5-year period that after the disaster. Sometimes we have to adjust that number because of data issues with the data. We use robust standard errors to adjust for correlated or non-independent error terms in the counties. And so we're really, and then we also use Bonferroni adjusted p-values. Both of these have the effect of making our estimates, our models more conservative so that we're more likely to have type 2 error where we would incorrectly reject the hypothesis. And so, so we're taking a very conservative approach. So we look at 5 cases. These cases we selected these 5 cases because they were the most destructive cases in terms of the dollar amount of destruction during the period for which we have data. So those are Hurricane Andrew, which hit Florida in 1992, and then 2 Southern California wildfire events in 1993 and 10 years later in 2003. We chose Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, which mainly affected Louisiana in 2005, and Hurricane Ike, which hit Texas in 2008. So we're really looking at 2 geographic areas, Southern California and then the Gulf Coast. And so you can see that these, I didn't want to show all of the case treatment and controls, but this gives you an idea of the regions that we're looking at. In the case of the Southern California, those are the counties, the red counties are the treated counties by the Southern California wildfires in 2003, which are very similar to the ones for 1993. And then in the Gulf Coast coastal counties, we're looking at, we see the red counties are the Hurricane Katrina and Rita affected counties in 2005, which we compare to all the other Gulf Coast counties. So I summarized the results. There are no numbers in this presentation, just to make it go faster. So these are the results for the treated counties from the difference in difference models. We estimated in 5 models, one for each of the case studies. And what we see here is that is really consistent for the Southern California wildfires with the hypothesis of risk aversion or change in the migration system, where the out-migration dimension of the migration system expanded in both events. So in the 1993, you see the expansion in the number of out ties. That's the number of connected counties where people were going in the event year, as well as in the post-event years, or the post-event period. And then in the Southern California wildfires, you see both an expansion of the ties and the average size of the outflows. We don't see, we see a few significant effects in the hurricane cases, but they really didn't show a consistent pattern, and so I'm not emphasizing them here. When we look at the untreated counties, we see results that, for the most part, let me just say that for the hurricane affected counties, the lack of a consistent pattern in the change in the migration systems is more consistent with the hypothesis of stability, where the hurricane is not affecting the migration system in the ways that we expected. And this is kind of surprising because my colleagues and I have looked at Hurricane Katrina and the effect of Hurricane Katrina on Orleans Parish and some of the other the Gulf Coast counties. And we found that there was an expansion of the migration system. So we were like, gosh, this is a little weird. But then when we look at the results for the untreated counties, what we find is that there was an expansion of particularly the out-migration system for the untreated counties, and then there was no difference between the untreated counties and the treated counties. That's what, and so basically what we see is that the entire region experienced a expansion of outflows and out ties during the event year and the post-event year. And then you also see, kind of consistent with this idea that there was just more instability in the system generally, you see the expansion of the in-migration dimension in the event year. And so we interpret this as just a generalized churning in the migration system within the region. And this is actually consistent with our prior findings, because what we found after Hurricane Katrina is that the migration system expanded in terms of it intensified. There were more people moving just in general, but there was also a regionalization of the migration system where there was just more movement within the disaster affected region between counties that were relatively unaffected and then the more affected counties. And so, for example, many people went from New Orleans, which displaced nearly everybody in the city. They went to Baton Rouge, they went to Houston, they went to Dallas. All of these are within the Gulf Coast region. And they moved back and forth as well. There was just a generalized churning. So what we conclude from looking at these 5 case studies is that, we see a lot. We see heterogeneous responses to migration responses to disasters. And this is really consistent with a lot of meta-analyses of migration responses to disasters, which find that, we find everything. Sometimes there's no change, sometimes there's increased out migration, what we would think of as like managed retreat. sometimes there's actually growth in disaster affected counties because in some ways disasters become economic opportunities. And so that's where you have the sort of growth machine hypothesis playing out, and the infusion of post-disaster assistance actually creates opportunities for affordable housing, for jobs in the construction industry. And then in other research I've done with a different set of colleagues, we found that in many counties in the US that are affected by hurricanes and tropical storms, there's really only a very short period of diminished growth, but that for the most part, places return to their pre-disaster trend line, whether that was growth or decline or stability. And so sometimes this really points out the value of using a quasi-experimental design where you have pre-disaster population trends in the model, because we might, if we just start our analyses from the point of the disaster, we might interpret the growth trend of the place as the effect of the disaster, when in fact it was simply a pre-disaster trend that had nothing to do with the disaster. So we find support for risk aversion and mobility, place attachment and immobility, also this sort of population churning, which I would consider to be more like place attachment than risk aversion. And so when I step away from these results and I think about how, whether or not we're really seeing sort of risk aversion actually playing out here or place attachment playing out here, I think a lot about what we've heard in some of the conversations and the effect of what's going on in actually the national context or a more broadly local context, where in the case of Southern California, you have a very tight housing market. And so after the wildfires destroy a bunch of housing, many people find themselves unable to afford to repair and rebuild. And this is really consistent with what Katie McConnell finds in her research on the Camp Fire, which is not in one of our cases, but where people were simply priced out of paradise. And that could be explain what we're seeing in the Southern California wildfires, whereas in the Gulf Coast region, where the housing markets are not so tight, and where hurricane seasons are a normal 6-month event, and people have been adapting to the effects of hurricanes for their entire life and understand how to rebuild and recover in place. What we might be seeing there in the Gulf Coast is simply a sort of system-wide accommodation to the occurrence of disaster events. So I think we need to always be conscious that when we're looking at a disaster, we're looking at a place that exists within a historical and a national and a local context. And if we focus so much on the disaster, we might be sort of missing the forest and only looking at a particular tree. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And now I'd like to introduce the new speaker, Shari Qatar.
Alrighty, good morning, everyone. My name is Shari Qatar, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Waterloo. Today, I'll be presenting on some of my doctoral research that I've been conducting in the past few years. Just a quick preface that this is a quick response disaster research, and a forthcoming paper will be coming out on this. But if there are questions on the long-term recovery, we can kind of discuss that a little bit later. But my research is entitled How Disaster Recovery Decision Making Unfolds.
Sorry, we have to reshare it.
Sorry about that. So the research is entitled How Disaster Recovering Decision Making Unfolds, Investigating Retreat and Rebuild Options for Post-Disaster Recovery in Merritt, BC, after the 2021 British Columbia Atmospheric River event. So just a show of hands, who heard of the Atmospheric River event in 2021? peak COVID time, plague the West Coast. Awesome. Okay, good to see that there are a few folks that are aware of it. So I just want to step back, given that we're at a predominantly American conference with American researchers, it would be nice to highlight some of the Canadian programs that are at the federal level. So when it comes to disasters, Canada is a little bit not as progressive in the terms of funding that we provide to our municipalities, but just to step back, we have a suite of programs that are outlined on the screen there. And so in the event of a large-scale disaster, whether that may be floods, wildfires, mudslides, the government of Canada actually provides disaster financial assistance through their DFFA program to provinces and territories for eligible disaster costs for response and recovery. Not related to flood mitigation, just letting you know, but directly related to disaster recovery. With this, provinces can use that financial support to help impacted communities. So municipalities then have to apply to the province and then receive funding that way. So it's the money gets trickled down that way. Alternatively, the government of Canada also has a DMAF fund, Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. And what that is it allows communities to invest in flood mitigation and infrastructure projects. And in 2021, the government of Canada actually invested $5 billion for the federal share recovery costs for the 2021 flood disaster. As you can assume, that was massively oversubscribed to, and it ran out within a couple months and the program closed. So that creates major problems for provinces who are trying to funnel money into plagued communities who clearly can't, are unable to recover. So for the DMAF fund, this was a 10-year project, and now the DMAF fund has been renewed as of 2023, just of February. We also have a program called the Flood Hazard and Identification Mapping Program, which is funding provided again to provinces and territories to help work on modeling and mapping and kind of update some of the maps, because a lot of these communities are working with legacy maps that are from the 70s. And so it's really hard to make changes or bylaw regulatory changes within the community. It's yet to be seen if these maps will be regulatory maps. So that's another gap in what's happening in the country. I do want to preface that the government of Canada does not have a flood insurance or national flood insurance program, similar to what they have in the US here, and neither do we have a relocation program. What this does is it creates a lot of interjurisdictional differences across the province when it comes to developing their own sort of buyout program, obviously in a post-disaster environment. So we'll talk about some of the variation. And finally, just want to highlight that the federal government released a national adaptation strategy, which highlights a suite of kind of 5 program areas, one of them being disaster resilience, which highlights in a 2-liner that sometime in the distant future, flood insurance and relocation should be on the radar of communities, but there's no plan of implementation. So still yet to be seen, and it's a huge gap in some of our programming and policy. Awesome, it's moving forward. Okay, so as many of you know, in November 2021, the British Columbia experienced massive atmospheric river event that caused severe flooding, landslides, mudslides, really across the interior and the coastal regions of the province. The flooding led to evacuation of approximately 18,000 people across the province, with extensive damage to infrastructure, homes, bridges, major highways that actually led to major supply chain issues for the entire country. So there were times where you couldn't get toilet paper on the shelf. This is peak COVID time, and we just couldn't get a major supply to the rest of the country because Vancouver is a major port as well. At that time, on November 15th, the city of Merritt, the Coldwater River breached its banks and flooded the community. What ended up happening was the wastewater treatment plant was fully inundated, and this forced the evacuation of 7,000 people out of their homes at 2 a.m. in the morning. Mind you, it's a town of 7,000 people, so there's no emergency communication system per se. It's really just knocking on doors to get people out of there as soon as possible. I heard from folks that they found out the next morning at 7 a.m. when their toilet didn't flush. And, they got a notice from their kids' school that school was closed that day. So that really was the state of what the community was going through. Afterwards, the government of BC actually deployed disaster financial assistance across the province, and homeowners, businesses, and tenants could apply towards this program. Just a quick caveat that only 80% of total eligible damages could be covered, up to $400,000 to rebuild. This is only to rebuild to its original state. So you can't really flood proof your home, and that creates major issues for the future flood resiliency of that community. At the time, Merit really took a three-pronged approach to how they were going to look at disaster recovery. Really started off with an emergency operations point of view, then led to short-term acute decision-making. So how do we repair our major roads that have been wiped out? How do we repair our major bridge that connects us to the Coquihalla Highway? And then now they're looking towards long-term resiliency. So what big flood mitigation projects can we take on to make our community more resilient? Because at this point, it still remains to be unseen. So as I noted, this is a quick response study, but we really wanted to understand, I have two sub-questions here, but first being a very broad-based question, because managed retreat is still fairly new within the Canadian domain, how this policy can be characterized within broader climate change adaptation planning at the municipal level, even at the provincial level. A lot of provinces are now developing some sort of flood strategy, and so how this can be built into that. And then more so how property bios as a tool kind of emerge on the local policy agenda, because I think just having that conversation is difficult and challenging, especially for communities that have stayed in place for so long. And so relocating an entire community of 7,000 people will erase them off the map effectively. So what other conversations can we have? Throughout the project, we kind of looked at using the disaster as a window of opportunity to incite policy change, whether at the local level when it comes to restricting redevelopment in the floodplain, or even the provincial level when it comes to creating some sort of interim buyout policy. For those folks who are waiting to be bought out, even if there's no policy available, creating some sort of ad hoc program that could help those people. And finally, we came up with some factors that looked at how those decisions are being made at the municipal level, with considerations of what was going on at the regional district at the time when they were developing their larger BC flood strategy. Some methods, not really going to go into it too much, but really was a mixed method study, qualitative in nature. We spoke to a bunch of folks on the ground, at the municipal, federal, provincial level as well, and people from insurance, disaster relief organizations, real estate professionals that ultimately talked about selling houses on the market 6 months later, which is crazy to me. And people knew about this and they still purchased those homes. So really maladaptive in cycle. This study didn't look at homeowners, but there's a subsequent study that's coming out that we did speak to homeowners who were talking about some of their experiences during the flood. Okay, so some of our results that we actually came across, like I mentioned, despite being a really small town, Merritt is really mighty. It took them less than 6 months to actually come up with a flood resilience plan. So they hired an engineering firm and came up with a suite of options that they tabled in front of the community. A year ago, actually, I was in Merritt and they tabled this at a community consultation. I want to say consultation in brackets because you can assume it was an open house and there wasn't really an avenue for consultation. It was really, this is what we propose. We don't have funding to do it, but this is what we propose. So they came up with a suite of 4 options and they wanted to show folks, this is what it would cost us. This is what the community would look like if we pursued any 4 of this. So the options, really, the first one was doing nothing. Of course, this will likely not receive serious consideration, but it was just to show that if we did nothing, there still is a what was the price tag there? $445 million price tag attached with that. And that would be ultimately, you would see municipal tax hikes, and they just wanted to show that there was still a cost of doing nothing because people were receiving financial aid through the province. We also saw on the other side of the spectrum, the buyout of the entire floodplain. 80% of the town is actually within the floodplain. And so similar to the first option, this option will not really receive serious consideration because you can't wipe out the entire city, but it was useful for comparison purposes. Option 3 and 4 are a combination of protection and retreat and accommodate measures. If you're familiar with the PARA model, but really it was emphasizing this use of waterside diking. And to enable this waterside diking, they actually have to acquire a suite of properties along the river to extend the footprint, the dike footprint that already exists there, but they need to extend that. So whether that's through eminent domain or that's a straight acquisition program for select properties, that was also tabled, and that actually was positively received by the community because they understood that, we needed to do this to make the entire community more resilient. And ultimately, the community is choosing to pursue the last option, which is option number 4, with a price tag of $160 million, which the community has no funding at the moment. And they're actively working with the province and the federal government to put in applications for larger projects. Of course, I don't think it's feasible that the entire $160 million plan will be implemented, but there are major portions of that they're actively pursuing. Just want to emphasize that the rhetoric throughout the community was really just to return home. It wasn't let's build back better or anything. It was just let's get people back home. As of now, there's 350 people still displaced from the community, and they've ultimately moved to neighboring communities in Kelowna and Kamloops, but it still remains to this day that they just want people to come home in whatever fashion that is, whether it's building temporary homes for them in a mobile park, but it's not so much focused on flood mitigation, but just returning people home, however that may be. So we came up with a couple of takeaways from this research. The first being we recognize that the provincial legislation for disaster financial assistance was really outdated. Like it needed to reflect what was going on in the ground. And so providing funds to rebuild to its original state just didn't make financial sense for the province, and including some sort of buyout options for those homes that already surpassed that eligible damage threshold to then be bought out. And they could use that to fund houses within the same community or neighboring community. In order to do that, you need to have available continuous and consistent funding, federal funding actually, for targeted buyouts and infrastructure upgrades, of which, like I mentioned, many of the federal programs have been oversubscribed to and since have closed for temporary periods. And this kind of leaves provinces hanging when it comes to municipalities asking them, well, hey, we need money to implement some of these programs, develop these policies, but there's nothing there. So that ends up being a huge problem. And actually, the BC government is in the process of, it's actually called Modernizing the DFA Act. It's coming out within the next year or so. So they're actively working on that. I did want to highlight a couple colleagues and I at Partners for Action actually developed a report a couple months ago. It's called Buying Out the Floodplain, and we came up with the recommendations for strategic relocation programs in Canada. So we looked at 3 ad hoc buyout programs across the country in Gatineau, Quebec, High River, Alberta, and Grand Forks, BC, that actually did pursue independent buyout programs. So Gatineau, they actually had a provincial policy, but the other 2 were ad hoc buyout programs that the municipalities asked funding from the provincial and federal governments and were able to buy out those properties. And we did we created a evaluation framework to identify how well were these programs made or implemented. And from that, we came up with these 3 matrix evaluation factors of social acceptability, cost efficiency, and political feasibility. And we compared the 3. And out of that, we came up with a slew of 8 recommendations. And based on that, I think a lot of communities like Merritt, who are now trying to develop their own acquisition program under the guise of a larger flood mitigation plan, can use these recommendations, to develop their own programs as well. We also saw that flood-affected homeowners needed significant support and guidance to navigate program requirements throughout the retreat process. Even throughout DFA, I think they were just highly unaware of how the application process went. And so we recognized that, provision of dedicated on-the-ground support was needed, support staff, to walk them through some of these processes. We also wanted homeowners, we also noted that homeowners needed assistance finding temporary accommodation, because in a town that has a 0% vacancy rate pre-flood, it's just where are they going to go? And that was the biggest thing. Also, we saw that there was a huge depreciation of mental health in the community post-flood. And so we wanted, we noted that flood-affected homeowners, renters, whatever that may be, needed help with counseling programs and social workers. And finally, we actually saw that there was a big need for affordable, available, and accessible transitional housing in a town, again, that has 0% vacancy rate. The city of Merritt actually applied for provincial funding, and they received funding to develop this program called the Transitional Housing Program. What that is they brought in manufactured temporary homes and put them on empty lots in a mobile park, and renters, there was a wait list. They created a matrices, and basically if you were highly vulnerable, you were kind of placed on that list for a variety of reasons, and you got first dibs on this subsidized, below market subsidized housing rent. This was for just because there was already a housing crisis pre-flood, and post-flood, the housing stock had depreciated. So this was a way to get people back, right? Really along the vein of return home. And so this it worked for them because it helped with the issue with the flooding, but it also helped with just the increase in the socioeconomic status of folks who were maybe not able to receive housing prior. And finally, we saw that managed retreat, like I said, is still really commonly used in a post-disaster setting in Canada. It's highly challenging to broach this topic in a pre-flood environment. Homeowners, like many of you know, will immediately shut that down. It's a difficult conversation to have. And so we saw that there was a big need for increased data sharing and communication processes between intergovernmental organization and NGOs. For example, there was organizations like Canadian Red Cross and Samaritan's Purse that were on the ground when it came to helping flood-affected homeowners. There was a city of Merritt that was also there, but they were all collecting the same information. So it was a redundancy information that was happening. So two issues there, because all these workers are oversubscribed to, they're overstressed. A lot of them are actually dealing with the flood themselves. So there's that additional trauma that they themselves are going through. So if there was some sort of data sharing platform, I know there's confidentiality agreements in place to protect these homeowners and these disaster victims, but it is important for that to be in place. Secondly, for trauma victims that have to tell their story over and over again, it's highly, I think it erodes their trust in government and some of these processes, because they just don't understand why they have to tell their story 3 times, right? To them, everybody is one, it's us versus them sort of. That's the sentiment that kind of goes on. So we recognize that there needs to be some sort of data sharing platform for these processes. And finally, I think, if not the most important, would be having prioritized provincial funding to facilitate the implementation of larger flood mitigation plans. For a community of 7,000 people and their price tag on their plan is $160 million, it's just not going to be done without the aid of provincial and federal funding. It's really great that they have a plan, but if they don't acquire any sort of funding or have pots of money available to apply to, then they're really not going to go far with their flood mitigation plan. And the community is coming up for renewal when it comes to developing their OCP, which is their official community plan. And now they're actively building a policy into that, which takes into account, future buyouts for properties along the river that are considered high risk. And with that, I'll conclude the presentation, but I do recommend if folks are interested in looking at our, if not for the recommendations, definitely the case studies are really interesting because there's a lot of interjurisdictional differences even across some of the provinces. But I'll leave it at that and thank you.
Okay, great. Hi, good morning. Can you all hear me okay? Awesome. Thank you so much for being here on the final day of the conference, echoing Beth. I'm really glad to be able to present this and start thinking through some of these questions with you all and managed retreat in the context of wildfire. My name's Catherine McConnell. I'm a sociologist based at Brown's Population Studies and Training Center, where I'm a postdoc researcher there, working with Beth, whose presentation you heard earlier. And I'm presenting some writing and thinking that I've been doing in collaboration with Liz Koslov, who's based at the University of California, where she's an assistant professor in the urban planning department, as well as the Institute for the Environment and Sustainability. And just to contextualize a little bit where Liz and I are coming from, because so much of this conference has been focused on water-based issues, I'm joining you from Boise, Idaho. Liz is coming, of course, from Southern California. She can't be here today, unfortunately, but as you can see from this map of fire occurrences over the past 20 years, we're really thinking and writing about these topics from two of the most fire-prone states in the US. So these questions hit really close to home for us. They're not far removed, and they're not just academic questions for Liz and I. So as we started doing this work together, we noticed that in much of the academic literature on managed retreat, there are often gestures to wildfire, among other hazards, but there's been really scarce empirical attention to what managed retreat actually looks like in the context of wildfire. And we also noticed that especially during wildfire season, so into summer and into fall, there are these growing normative calls for managed retreat from fire-prone places that we've seen coming out of the media. So just to give you a few examples, this is from an article published several weeks back about State Farm's withdrawal from California in response to fire risk. We're seeing sort of a call from an economist for property buyouts in the context of wildfire. Even more explicitly last fall, there was a series of opinion pieces run in the Los Angeles Times, a series called Rebuild, Reburn, that specifically argues for managed retreat from fire-prone areas, but specifically from rural fire-prone areas, which is notable. While we're seeing these types of normative calls for retreat from fire-prone areas, Liz and I see that there's actually very limited conceptual or empirical research on what this would look like, which is sort of where our research and thinking is entering into the picture. We're worried that simply applying approaches to managed retreat that have been developed in empirical work that done over many years in the flood context, just cookie cutter applying this to the fire context really risks two things. One, maladaptation, because fire is its own specific context. And two, it risks really overlooking novel, potentially unique approaches to retreat that are specific to fires and may not work in the context of flooding. So our work that we're presenting today is charting the landscape of research that we think needs to happen before we can actually get to these normative questions of whether any community can or should be retreating from fire-prone areas. And we do this through a close reading of both the managed retreat literature, again, coming primarily from floods, but also looking into fire literature from across countries around the world. And we approach this work really agnostically. Again, we're really not trying to make any normative case at this juncture for the managed retreat from fire-prone areas. And I want to start by acknowledging I know that we're in this conference after a major smoke event in New York City. So I imagine that these questions of wildfire smoke and mobility may be on a lot of your minds. But what was hopefully made apparent to those of you who are less familiar with fires, who experienced the smoke event, is that the footprint, the spatial footprint of fire smoke is extremely large. It's very variable. It can shift in unexpected ways. So given how geographically diffuse smoke footprints can be, we've really constrained our focus to thinking about the direct wildfire burning or potential to burn of landscapes or of the built environment rather than smoke. So for the time being, we've ended up through our research and thinking landing on 4 different categories that we think best capture the range of initiatives that could be termed wildfire retreat. So first, maybe closest to what we see in the flood context, government programs could support the preemptive acquisition of residential buildings in fire-prone areas. So for instance, as buyouts. Second, rebuilding of structures after a wildfire could be intentionally constrained, for instance, through local government zoning policies. Similarly, and third, policies might limit the new construction of undeveloped high-risk wildland areas. And then finally, instead of relocating people, risk-producing infrastructures such as above-ground power lines could be removed or undergrounded. So I'll speak a bit more to this type of infrastructural retreat later in the presentation. As you can imagine, these 4 different buckets have very different cost, logistic, governance, as well as equity implications. So we think that these 4 approaches to wildfire retreat really need to be analyzed distinctly. So with these 4 sort of core types of wildfire retreat in mind, I want to briefly walk you through the areas of research that Liz and I think are really important for sort of charting out some of these questions. First, social scientists should be documenting the long-term visions of those who live in fire-affected places. And we think that this really needs to go beyond investigating just perceptions of hazard risk to better understand whether different residents and communities seek to remain in place, to relocate, and then ask whether the residents and local governments have the resources and capabilities to actually realize these long-term visions. And do we see any political coalitions emerging around proposals to remain in place or retreat? And I know that Liz has made the point that very much in contrast to her work on Staten Island, where residents actively sought government buyouts to support relocation after Hurricane Sandy, to the best of our knowledge, we have not seen similar cases of residents of fire-prone places seeking buyouts from those areas. However, we have seen some efforts to limit new building through zoning. Second, research on wildfire retreat must very seriously consider the long-term land management implications. So flood-based managed retreat initiatives may not always plan or budget for this long-term management after retreat. And instead, sometimes land can transition from residential occupation to being more or less unmanaged. But looking at past land use histories in the context of fire suggests that moving people away from fire-prone places does not necessarily actually lead to reduced fire risk. So for instance, there's a really rich literature on what's known as land abandonment in Mediterranean regions in Europe, particular places like Spain and Portugal, where we see depopulation of rural agricultural regions in the mid-20th century led to abandoned land that has subsequently caused more severe wildfires due to fuels buildup. So while not in Europe, you can see what this might look like in a US-based example. This is a photo I took in the town of Paradise several years after the Camp Fire, where you can see this very invasive shrub has regrown on the site of the home. So this, of course, is a fuel that can sort of facilitate fire spread in the future. This is not a no-risk landscape that you're looking at just because it's already burned. So this need for long-term land stewardship to us suggests that the cost structure of wildfire retreat may actually differ from some forms of flood-based retreat, which may assume more upfront costs. Third, researchers and practitioners need a clearer picture of which existing managed retreat policy tools are and are not well suited for a wildfire context. I think the example of buyouts being the most relevant here, where the purchase of high-risk properties for open space may reduce risk, but it may not, depending on how that land is actually managed in the long term. But I think more exciting are questions around what new policy or planning tools might be developed or creatively adapted in the fire context. So to give you a few examples, there's an emerging initiative in the town of Paradise to actually pool land holdings and make a sort of natural buffer around residential areas. There's also really interesting experimental work going on the use of aspen groves, aspen being much less flammable. So scientists are exploring whether these groves might be used as sort of quote unquote living fire breaks. Fourth, most managed retreat projects, as we all know, aim to move people away from hazardous areas. But the proposition of wildfire retreat invites the question of, rather than people, the risk-producing infrastructures and land uses might instead be moved or dismantled. So I'll give 2 examples of what this might look like. We know that here in the US and in Australia, likely other places as well, electricity lines are responsible for igniting a substantial number of very high severity wildfires. So one approach to infrastructural retreat could be to underground these power lines. Second, not so much in the US, but in places like Portugal, Chile, Australia, and South Africa, there have been documented cases of very destructive fires where fire spread has actually been facilitated through adjacent commercial forestry plantations, such as the eucalyptus groves shown here. And in case studies of some of these fires, it's really interesting. The policy response has not been to remove people from those places, but it has been to pivot and remove these plantation forests or prevent the siting of these plantation forests next to residential areas. So this is a really, I think, different approach to retreat, and one that's fundamentally targeting infrastructures and political economies of land and land use that produce risk rather than the residents who experience risk. So finally, because Liz and I both have sociological backgrounds, we are also really interested in this concept of wildfire managed retreat as a form of discourse that can and should be analyzed in its own right. So we're really interested in these questions like, are residents of fire-prone places being portrayed as the victims of climate change, the victims of corporate malfeasance, as was very much the case in the Camp Fire, which was ignited by a private utility company, subsequently found guilty, legally guilty of manslaughter. Or very much in contrast, are we seeing residents of fire-prone places framed as having made quote unquote bad climate decisions? So we think that these public as well as scientific narratives that emerge around regions' hazardousness, as well as around residents' deservingness of government support, will have important consequences for how policy and funding priorities are established. So I'll stop there, but I just want to flag that Liz and I are very much trying to build out a community of practice with other folks who are thinking about these issues of wildfire, mobility, retreat. So if that's you, or if you're interested to be in conversation, we really encourage you to reach out and look forward to learning from you and hearing from you. So thank you so much, really appreciate it.
Thank you to all the speakers. Now may you all follow me to the panel in the middle and feel free to ask any questions or concerns that you have.
I think we have already kind of know why people move. But how to determine the people, the place should they be moving, right? Because we can move people from fire and ended up moving them from a road place, or we can move people from a flood from areas such as New York City, move a place where there could be some other issues. My question is how to determine what is the best place to move people, right? Considering that there is no geography or place that will be immune to the effects of climate change. So how to determine that?
So I do want to say that I don't think you said, you started your question by saying, I think we already know why people move. And I would disagree with that. We don't really know why people move. People move for all kinds of reasons, and the environment is just one factor in that. And so, furthermore, how relocation decision-making is really constrained by what is available in the market. And so when people are making migration decisions, it's not as though they can just freely choose with full information between places that are more or less climate, exposed to some climate hazard. Every single county in the United States has, in the past, I don't know, since 1960, experienced or declared a disaster that's for one reason or another, usually related to the environment. So there's really no place that is completely free of hazards. And so I think we really need to interrogate some of these assumptions that we have. I really appreciated, Katie, your calling out the New York Times magazine article about blaming people for, should the government pay for people's bad decisions? I think it's really, we really need to unpack these decisions. But I appreciate your point about how do we decide what places are relatively safe, or how do we create migration destinations that are safer? And I'll turn it over.
Do you want to go?
Well, I was wondering if Kensuke is still on the line. I thought his work might speak to this a bit. Maybe not. I will really punt on this question. As a sociologist, I am not in the business of telling people where to go. And I agree with Beth that it's hard to identify any one place that will be completely free of climate hazards. Yeah. Do you have any?
I was just going to add, we know people are going to go, but at least make it fair for them to move, you know, in the process. If you're developing some sort of buyout policy, it's not a relocation, it is a one-time transaction. So at least make it fair and make the compensation fair enough, and then incentivize folks so that they can move somewhere, preferably in the same community, but if not, make it worth their while, right? It is such a drastic change in their life, make it a positive experience. And that's hard to do when it's such a groundbreaking decision that, you know, completely changes the fabric of your life. But I think if you can do it in a way that's somewhat palatable to that recipient, then it's a better process for everybody involved.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's really worth, it was worth getting up for so, thank you. They held together really well. This question is for Fussell. I'm really interested in the migration systems approach to analysis. So you talked about how there's this change in the character of the churn before and after an event. And so one of the key challenges, I think, is understanding the effect of multiple events on this sort of overlapping mobility decisions that people are making. You know, you referenced a few different strategies that are taking place simultaneously, and that's fantastic. People care about that. But just the question is there any evidence that you saw, I think it was Katrina and then Irma, of any shift between the character of churn following multiple events?
Yeah. So our approach here really isolated single events. Like Katrina and Rita happened within a month of each other. And so we really can't disentangle their effects, given that our model is just looking at, you know, change between year 1 and year 2. And so everything that happened during that year drives, you know, it drives the shift in the migration system. However, using this data, and as I said, you know, we're working on improving and looking at alternative sources of county to county, or maybe even track to track migration flows. We can also start thinking about the cumulative effect of past disasters, particularly when they happen at closer temporal intervals, so that you can't, you know, recover between hurricane seasons. And we're seeing that happen in Louisiana right now. So the data is accumulating right now to begin looking at that. But anecdotally, I think you will see that and I think some of the meetings here, people from Louisiana represented this perspective that it was only recently, when there were literally back-to-back hurricane seasons that were highly destructive in parishes that were already declining in population, rural parishes or small towns that were already experiencing population loss, that people really began considering relocation. Prior to that, there was a sentiment of, we're very attached to our place. We are not leaving. We're just going to rebuild. We're going to come back better. All of that boosterism. And then there was a sense of like, that's not going to work. So, so I think that's an excellent question, but we're working on it. Yeah.
So, I'm just wondering if you could unpack that last point a little bit more. If you've gone into any detail about, you said that there was in my head, that sounds like a network effect, that the more people are leaving, the less sustainable that settlement, for want of a better word, is. Do you see that as have you gone into any detail of whether it's a network effect, whether it's because schools are closing because they're not sustainable, or is it simply more of a ephemeral loss of confidence in a location? Have you been able to go that further into those drivers?
So that would not be part of the research that I presented today, where the social networks that you're talking about are at the level of the individual and households, whereas the networks that I'm talking about are place-based networks. But, there's certainly a literature out there about how cumulative causation of migration operates, where part of what's being represented in our data is that the fact that we can sort of predict destinations after a disaster based on where people were going before the disaster, because those are the places where people already have family and friends. There's most likely a sort of cultural continuity in the communities, where in this case of Louisiana, there would be other sort of maybe Cajun identified people in the destination that would be more culturally familiar and incorporating to the migrants. And so that kind of process, and of course, family and friends provide advice and assistance and connect people with housing and jobs. And so all of those social network effects are sort of aggregated up in our migration decision and in our migration system analysis, but it's not, we're looking at the county level. And so I can't speak to your question, although there's plenty of literature out there that can. Katie, maybe you want to? No.
Okay. Thanks to all the speakers. It was a wonderful session. I have two questions, one for Beth and one for Catherine. For Beth, how did you choose your control counties? I know you mentioned that they were like non-IA receiving counties and were kind of proximate, but do you think the choice of those control counties had any effect on the effect that you saw on the difference in difference? And then for Catherine, I'm really interested in this idea of like this public infrastructural retreat. Do you have any hypotheses about what kind of like patterns or signals that public infrastructure retreat has for residential retreat, or vice versa, and kind of the relationship between those two different patterns?
Do you know the control question? I go ahead. Go ahead. So, a fixed effects model is when you use fixed effects, you're comparing the within county differences, and so essentially your control groups and your treatment groups are sort of being compared within. It's within the group, and so, but having said that, we can test to see whether there are differences between the treatment and control groups that we think might be theoretically interesting, that we should look into and that we should unpack. The fixed effects approach is a very conservative approach where you're taking it, you're basically controlling for everything that's time invariant in the county. And so that takes care of that issue. But I think, I'm a curious person and I want to look deeper into like who are in these control groups and treatment groups and or what are the characteristics of those counties. So I think, you can start theorizing and pulling out some of the factors that you think might be relevant. So that's all future research.
Just to add a bit more of a point, because I've been involved in the control selection for that project. And so for the hurricane counties, we choose other coastal Gulf Coast counties, which have been used in prior research, looking at similar questions around population mobility and hurricane impacts. And for fires, obviously in a very different geography, so we can't use the same approach. And we used second order Queen's contiguity controls, which could be explored in different ways. And so thank you for raising that question. I just want to make sure I understand your question correctly about the infrastructural retreat. Is the question how that approach may differ from residential retreat, or would you mind reframing your question?
About the ordering, potential like chronological order of like public infrastructure retreat versus homeowner retreat.
Yeah, it's hard to say because some of these approaches to wildfire managed retreat are, I think, hypothetical still and experimental. So in some cases, we found actual examples of the things we describe happening. So for instance, zoning codes that prohibit new construction or reconstruction in certain areas. But in other cases, it's almost imagining a new type of retreat. And I think infrastructural retreat is one of those, in particular around power lines, where this would obviously be hugely costly, as is residential retreat. But I don't know of great examples of that happening on a large scale. So I actually don't have a great sense yet of what any sort of ordering would look like. But did that answer your question fully? Okay, thanks for the question. I appreciate it.
Okay, so we only have time for the one quick question. This is an online question by Mali Dumont Compero. What are your considerations for managed retreat in the context of wildfire in terms of environmental justice? Any views on community-led processes?
Yeah, so I think I outlined the 4 different broad categories of wildfire-related retreat, and I think those have really different implications for the people who live in places. And like first, one of my core concerns for wildfire retreat initiatives are how they would intersect with the housing crisis. We know a lot of fire affected places also have extremely tight housing markets. So if we are preventing reconstruction of homes or preventing new construction of homes, does that sort of further feed into a general inability of folks with fewer resources to access housing? And 2, I think a piece that's really, really critical for the wildfire conversation is what retreat means for tribal communities whose sovereignty can be tied to specific land holdings. And so for these communities, the question of retreat may look very different than for folks who do not have the same sovereign ties to land. I think that's how I'd answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you, presenters. And let's give a big round of applause to these amazing presenters. And this concludes the 14C Natural Disasters and Managed Retreat session. Thank you and have a good rest of your day.